Hi there, and welcome back to yet another episode at Station Road. Now, this particular video is in combination with another video that I've just released as well at the same time, which relates to the surgery that was undertaken on the hillside at the end of the new raised goods yard section. So one of the components in that particular video was remodeling the reservoir that is up on top of the hill section. So there's a link up in the top corner for that particular video, and as I said, it really does tie in with this video, and this video is specifically relating to the resin pour for the remodeled reservoir on top of the hill. So I began with making a wee mock-up of the canal using the same materials in order to make sure that the resin was going to behave how I wanted it to. And then I also did some additional pours with various types of tints to see how I can alter the colour of the resin. So I think without further ado, let's just get into what I got up to. Right, so we're going to do this test pour of resin and just see how it goes. So this is very experimental, so I'm not even sure whether the outcome is going to be favourable at all. Now, what I'm actually using is this product here, which is Scungy Clear Cast. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is a New Zealand product, so I'm not even sure whether you could get this anywhere else in the world. It is actually made here in New Zealand, in Wellington, so New Zealand's capital. So I'm not sure how well this is going to work. Now, the only reason I'm using this is because it is basically half the price of the Woodland Scenic's deep pour. So I just picked this up at the local hardware store, and it is a diamond clear liquid embedding resin. So really what it's designed for is to be able to embed artifacts or so forth into a resin block. So in effect, it is kind of a deep pour type resin, so it's not a resin that you would apply over wood finishes or anything like that, or bench tops. It is actually a deep pour resin, but whether or not it's going to work in this scenario, I have no idea. One of the points that is made in the instructions for this product is there is some shrinkage, so that could be an issue, particularly with a large area as such as the reservoir, that it may shrink too much. But for half the price, I thought I'd give it a go, and if it does actually work, then it could well be a viable solution that isn't so expensive as the Woodland Scenic's product. Now, you can actually tint this as well, so in the instructions you can apply a tint to this, and what I'm actually going to do is apply a Vallejo earth brown tint to this product just to give it that slightly murky effect. So this is the test basin, if you could call it that I have made up, and is basically made from exactly the same materials as the actual reservoir. So this will give me a good testing bed to see if it's actually going to work. So as you can see, I've actually applied some of the Metcalf brick texture to two sides of it, and then it's had the same spray paint effect, and then the whole thing has been coated with the Mod Podge as well to seal everything in, which is basically what I'm going to do once I've completed the main reservoir. So with the Mod Podge, it creates a little bit of a texture which might be a bit difficult to make out there. So you can actually see it does actually create a bit of a texture for the bed of the reservoir, so I think that will be sufficient enough to possibly see that coming through from the resin. So when it comes to do the actual reservoir itself, I'm going to probably do several layers of the Mod Podge and kind of make it a bit lumpy so that it's not a perfectly flat, smooth base to the reservoir. So this product's a little bit different, I think, really, in some respects, because that is the main component, and then this is actually the activator or the catalyst, and it's actually just very, very tiny amounts that you actually put in here to create the activation of the resin. So unlike, I think, Woodland Scenics, it could even be sort of 1 to 2 or 2 to 1 parts, whereas this you're only adding drops in order to activate the resin. So for this wee test, I've got myself a plastic bottle. I've marked out 100 mils. I'm going to just make up 100 mils of this. This tin here is 500 mils or half a litre, so there's quite a reasonable amount in there, and I think that will be enough to do the entire reservoir, as long as this stuff actually works satisfactory. If this test is a fail, then I may actually resort to the Woodland Scenics product and bite the bullet for the price that it comes in at. So the process for this particular type of resin is you pour in the quantity you need, of course, into the plastic bottle, and then you add the tint that you require. So once you've mixed in the tint and mixed that in thoroughly, then you add the activator as the last component. So for 100 mils, according to the instructions, it's going to be 1.5 mils of catalyst for the 100 mils. Now I'm probably actually going to use a little bit less than that, because they do say that the more catalyst you add into this, the higher the chances are that the resin will actually begin to crack when it cures. So the less amount of catalyst reduces that cracking potential, but of course I think possibly it will take longer to dry as well. The other key component, of course, is to mix the catalyst thoroughly, and they say 1 to 2 minutes of mixing, but to mix it gently, not vigorously, because of course as you mix it you're going to end up adding air bubbles into the mixture. So we're just going to pour 100 mils into this container, and as you can see I've got plastic down, I've got my gloves on, because this stuff is pretty nasty stuff in terms of the chemical makeup and compound of this. So that's our 100 mils, and I've got all sorts of things handy, paper towels to clear away any excess, and this is just a bit of throwaway plastic, so of course I can just scoop everything up afterwards and bin it. So that's the base compound in there. Now we're just going to add in some drops of tint. Now this I'm just going to do drop by drop, because I certainly don't want to go overboard with the tint. I still want to be able to have a semi-translucent look to it, and possibly even to see the bed. So according to the instructions here, this is the process. This particular company, they actually produce some tints and dyes that you can actually use with this. So I'm kind of hoping this Vallejo is actually going to work in here and not be a clash with the chemical structure. So any amount of stirring is actually going to create bubbles, of course, but I did spot a technique that somebody was using on one of their YouTube videos where to remove bubbles you just simply blow on the resin through a straw, and apparently it's the carbon dioxide in our breath that actually releases air bubbles. So I'm kind of hoping that that might be the case, and I'll grab a tube of some sort and blow on the compound or the mixture to release air bubbles. So we've sort of got a bit of a murky colour in there, and I think I might actually go some more. So that's our resin in there, and it's certainly looking pretty murky, and there certainly are a lot of bubbles in there. I'm almost sort of wondering whether that Vallejo may not be suitable. It almost sort of looks like it's gone into a kind of powdery or speckledy effect in there. So I just don't know. This may or may not work, but there's no harm in trying these things. So we're going to put our activator in. Right, so I've just taken the dropper off the top of this because I'm just going to use a pipette to get the exact amount that I actually want. So they say 1.5 mils for this amount, but I'm actually just going to go between the two, so 1.25 mils of activator. And now we've got to give this a good stir, and they say between 1 and 2 minutes. So if it's not stirred properly and not fully mixed, then apparently you can end up with sort of soft spots in the resin. Right, I think that's been thoroughly mixed, so now at the moment of truth we'll see if this is watertight. So we're going to leave this now and come back to it a bit later on. Apparently it sort of starts to begin curing after about 2 hours, and then of course we're looking at a full 24, possibly 48 hours before it's fully cured, so, or at least going solid. So we'll come back to it later on. So it's now been a few days later from when I did the initial pour on these test pours, and this is the end result of the wheat test basin that I made up. So it has more or less actually worked, but one of the things that I have noticed is that the Vallejo tint is not really ideal because it's pretty much blocked out the bottom, but it could be a viable solution if you're into more sort of turbulent waters that were more silty and so forth, that it would actually work. And also what I've done in this one too as well is there was a little bit of shrinkage, but very, very minimal, and probably maybe a millimetre around the edge. And so what I did is topped it up with another layer on top, and that seems to have eliminated any sign of shrinkage around the outer edges, so it does sort of look reasonably okay, and actually you do get quite a nice sort of watery effect, and that's by not doing anything else but just letting it set as it is. So based on the fact that the Vallejo tint didn't really work, or I wasn't sort of happy with the result I wanted, I did a little bit of investigation and went to the local artist shop and bought some of these, which were recommended by one of the staff members, and this is alcohol based, whereas I think obviously the Vallejo is, I think, water or acrylic based, which is probably why it doesn't really work. So you'll have to excuse the pronunciation, but I think it's Jacquard or Jacquard Pinata tints, and unfortunately the art shop didn't have a huge selection in stock, so this is sort of a reddish brown, which is not really ideal. There's a shadow grey, and we sort of had a rainforest green, so I thought by kind of maybe blending these tints a little bit we could maybe arrive at a colour that was suitable, and this is what we arrived at, and that's kind of the colour I'm after, sort of a bit of a stagnant kind of brownish colour. This is probably a little bit too heavy in terms of its tint, but in terms of the actual colour tone, that's what I'm after. Now, one of the things that I've actually done to this test is then gone over the top of this with a gloss Mod Podge, which of course gives the rippled effect, and it certainly works quite well. So I basically brush the Mod Podge on, and then using a straw I was able to blow the Mod Podge around, and it creates that ripple effect. That's of course a technique that I've also spotted on other YouTube channels. So I did actually also manage to get hold of some of the actual Norski pigment, which is actually more like a paste rather than a dye. So this is specifically designed for this product, and this is what we've got in here. Now, I've only just done this test, so it's actually still liquidy, and I'm actually not that keen on it. I put in the tiniest wee speck, and it's amazing how dark that had gone. So that was just the tiniest wee drop in that, and it's sort of gone a real sort of earthy brown colour, which maybe it might be better in a large quantity and still just put in the most microscopic drop of this stuff in order for it to work. So I think the outcome really is that I'm probably going to stick with these Jacquard Pinata dyes, or solvent based inks as they're described here, and once again create a mixture or a blend that gets a tone similar to this. So I'm just adding some finishing touches to the reservoir channel, and I thought maybe it might be a nice idea to have maybe a little bit of a build-up of silt from the curve of this channel, and that of course giving the opportunity for some reeds to set hold in the silt. So I've just made these up from the bristles from some mutilated paintbrushes, and daubed some hot glue onto parchment paper and just poked them in, waited for the hot glue to set, and then I've just glued all of these individually to a piece of high density foam that's been formed into kind of a little bit like a silt bank that's on this curve. So I'm not going to go overboard with overgrowth within the channel, apart from maybe this little bit here, because I did do a little bit of research and did find waterways, canals and so forth. They did have scenarios like this where obviously silt had built up and reeds had started growing on the edge. So, and this was even in situations where it was a fully contained man-made canal with stone or brick edging. So as you can see, I've also continued on from the last video and applied some weathering and also mounted all these additional infrastructure components into place. So I used weathering powders, a little bit of acrylic paint as well, to really sort of grime it up and make it look rather filthy. And I think it's sort of come together quite well. So the finishing touch really was going over everything with the matte Mod Podge, and that just essentially is going to seal everything in, because of course there is a lot of card and MDF products in here, which I'm assuming resin would possibly soak into if it wasn't sealed beforehand. So I've sealed up the other end of the waterway with just a piece of plastic cut out from an ice cream container, and I've attached that with a bead of silicone gel. So that's the same product that I actually used to seal all the crevices and so forth around the actual waterway itself, and I've let that go off, and then of course the matte Mod Podge was gone over the top of that. So I'm pretty confident that we've got an absolutely watertight reservoir here that we can now begin doing the resin pour. So the moment of truth is about to occur, and I have my vat of resin here and we're about to pour it in. So I'm doing this in two layers. So there's a main sort of thicker base layer which is with this colour, and I have changed the colour a bit, gone for more of a slightly more greenish tone, and then there'll be a final top thinner layer which I may just do with plain clear resin. So without wasting any time, let's just begin this pour and see what happens. So I've made 500 mils up for a start, because I did actually do an accurate calculation of the volume of this reservoir, and it comes in just over 600 mils. So that's the first pour in there, and there'll be, as I mentioned, an additional pour over the top, which I may or may not tint. It just really depends on how this goes. And I'm just going to let this go off a little bit, and then just here we've got some wee twigs which I picked up out of the garden, and these have been sprayed with a matte clear, and I'm actually going to jam them down here in this grate before I pour the final or second layer of resin. Right, so it's now the next day, and this is now very solid. So it's kind of interesting working with this in a much larger area, this particular resin that I've used, and I'm relatively happy with it. There were just a few anomalies that occurred, and I think it really comes down to the quantity of resin used. And I think if I was ever doing something similar again using this particular resin, I would probably change the technique. So I did an initial sort of base pour, as you saw, and once that started to cure, of course it shrank as I expected, but it shrank quite a bit more, and so in some areas there was a gap of potentially several millimeters around the edge where it had pulled away, and I wasn't too worried about it because I was going over it with another thinner layer of resin that would of course fill in those areas, and that has actually worked. So it has gone in and filled in the areas, but still a little bit of shrinkage in some areas, potentially up to 1 millimetre. One of the things that I did come across is it actually shrank off the base of the reservoir, so it actually pulled up and created these sort of air gaps underneath, which gave it some changes in tone. And I guess you could get away with it and it would be okay, but I wasn't overly happy with that result. So I think in a future pour, if I ever do another pour on anywhere else on the layout, I would probably pour down just a very thin layer of resin first, only really a couple of millimeters at the most, as a base pour, and then let that go off, and hopefully with the smaller quantity it wouldn't shrink from the underside, and then pour in another layer that might be a slightly deeper layer, and then finish off with another thin layer on top. And I think that would probably resolve any issues that came up with that particular resin pour lifting from the base. But I think we're going to get away with this, because now I'm actually going to start adding the gloss Mod Podge over the top and actually building up a ripple texture. And particularly in areas here, there'll be sort of a texture of flowing water coming in around here, and I'm going to try and even sort of do some kind of foam type textures on top, which you might find in, say, slightly semi kind of polluted water, I guess. And I did a bit of research and came across plenty of examples where there's all sorts of different types of effects with the surface of the water. So I'm going to go ahead with this Mod Podge and start building up some ripple effects. And the plan is, or the hope is, that the ripple effects will actually disguise this resin that's lifted from the actual bed of the reservoir. So the reservoir is now mostly complete. So after I applied the gloss Mod Podge to create the ripple effect, I set about wondering how to do this sort of foam type semi-polluted sort of component that would go on top. And I did experiment with the test resin pours that I did in various different methods, stippling, sort of acrylic paint and all sorts of things. And then I sort of drew on my experience from when I studied fine art, and using a type of marbling technique which actually involved mixing a little bit of acrylic paint with a lot of water and some dishwashing liquid, and shaking that up in a container quite vigorously until it really foamed up and you had quite a lot of little wee frothy bubbles. Now that was then applied in the areas where I wanted this sort of foamy type polluted component, and of course as the bubbles pop and evaporate, the foam begins to recede, and of course the paint component in it starts to actually leave its impression on the surface of the resin. So I think that effect has actually come out quite well. I then actually dabbed just a few other tints of paint, just sort of a really light brown, to sort of create that sort of scungy type effect within the foam, and it's come out quite well. And of course it's also had the ability to sort of hide the anomaly in the bottom of the resin where it sort of lifted up from the base of the reservoir. So in all, I'm relatively happy now with the result, and it has taken a little bit of work over several days, waiting for things to dry and going over with further layers of the gloss Mod Podge, and then where the foam bits are that completely dried out, I went over those with the matte Mod Podge, which creates a little bit of a satin finish, because I didn't really think those areas would be completely glossy, nor would they be really completely flat. So there's a few more things, of course, to finish off on the reservoir. Of course, I've still got the capping stones to add around the stone walls, and then of course the entire area surrounding the reservoir of course needs its scenic treatment, so that's grasses and overgrowth and bushes, trees, and all of that stuff that needs to be added in. So I think in the next episode, now that this reservoir is sorted out, I can move back to where I'd started building up layers of hillside with the foam material and start carving the hillside and just seeing how that works out. So a little bit of an update on the coal merchant's yard that I was working on before I jumped into this Hillside Surgery project. I'm still waiting on some items that I ordered for detailing, which are still in the post somewhere around the world. So I'm holding off on the coal merchant's yard until I actually get these items in. So I hope you've enjoyed this dual episode at Station Road, and hopefully you've got some ideas and inspiration for your own layouts. So I'll sign off for now, and do take care everyone. Look after yourselves. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.